Throughout history, people have been sentenced to death for many reasons. Usually, when someone is sentenced to death, there is nothing that can be done besides waiting for the scheduled date and saying goodbye to life. However, occasionally, there are records of people who, even though condemned to this penalty, survived in an unbelievable way after going through the execution process. That is what we will see here today. In 1984, the young Rommel Broom, who was 28 at the time, went to trial under the allegation of a barbaric crime he was suspected of committing. According to investigations, he had allegedly abducted, abused, and taken the life of a girl at that time, with all evidence pointing to him as the suspect. He ended up being sentenced to death, but due to the long waiting list for the lethal injection and the victim's right to appeal, the sentence kept getting postponed, and Broom remained imprisoned. It was only in 2003 that, after a request from the victim's family, the case was reopened. A new DNA test was carried out, the suspect continued to be considered guilty, and his sentence was rescheduled. The years then went by, the waiting list came to an end, and in 2009 he was finally sent to take the lethal injection. The next 2 hours after the injection, however, surprised the medical team, even resulting in an interruption order by the then governor of Ohio, Ted Strickland. The suspect's body seemed not to feel the effect of the injection. There were 18 attempts at death by injection, all unsuccessful. Rommel's body simply did not react, and the criminal appeared unfazed, enduring the overdose. After that happened, Broom began to debate about death penalties and was even heard by some important places on this topic. After a long legal battle and a review of the medication, Broom was sent again to receive the lethal injection, this time in 2022, when he eventually passed away. The Mexican soldier, also known as El Fusilado or the Executed One, survived an execution in 1915 by a firing squad. Moguel is said to have taken 8 or 9 bullets in his body before receiving a shot to the head, and he survived all of that. According to information, the detainee ended up surprising everyone by still breathing and living even after the barrage of gunfire he had gone through. Wenceslao stayed alive but carried some marks on his body. His face also became deformed due to the impact of the bullet, yet what matters is that he managed to survive. In photos and records from that time, which are not many, we can see Wenceslao with his face completely disfigured because of what he had endured. He became known as a supernatural being back then for surviving it all. On a night in May of 1946, Captain Efi Foster and Officer Vincent Venezia from a prison in Louisiana in the United States were having a few drinks to relax. That was because the next day they would have to execute a supposed criminal. It was Willie Francis, a black teenager of 17 years old, sentenced for the murder of pharmacist Andrew Thomas. On the day of his execution, Willie did not expect any outcome different from what the system had chosen for him. So, when he saw one of the officers walking toward the lever of the electric chair, the young man just closed his eyes. But something happened. Instead of the end, however, Willie felt excruciating pain throughout his body, where he himself said it felt like thousands of pins and needles pricking him. Thus, in a miraculous way, he managed to survive the execution. The young man's case quickly made the front pages of newspapers. For many, that was proof, sent directly from God, that Willie could not die. In the end, the teenager had survived the electric chair. Moreover, according to investigations, the evidence found at the time pointed to other people as more likely suspects than Willie. But due to a racial issue, he was placed as the main suspect. As you may know, in some countries, women accused of adultery may be sentenced to lose their lives by stoning. Well, in 1997, the Iranian Zolika Kadkoda, who was 20 years old at the time, was sentenced to this horrible penalty. She was buried up to her waist, and as the stones were thrown, the community ended up gathering to begin protesting against that punishment. However, when the stoning was suspended, it seemed to be too late. Or perhaps not, because right after the punishment was interrupted, Zolika's body was taken to the morgue, and there, the medical staff discovered that she was still breathing. She was taken to the hospital and managed to recover from her injuries in an unbelievable way. Besides having survived that brutal penalty, many protests were carried out in her defense, and the accusations against her were dropped. Thus, she could move on with her life normally, and it is believed that she was truly accused by mistake. On the 23rd of January of 1885, the Exeter prison in England thought it would carry out a hanging. However, it was nothing but an illusion, because for some reason, the trap door of the gallows, that is, the door that opens under the condemned's feet so he can fall, simply did not open, and he ended up escaping. The jailers were baffled by the situation, as they had checked its functionality shortly beforehand. That same day, 2 more attempts were made, totaling 3, and in all of them some unknown force spared the condemned, so the execution was postponed until the next day. The prisoner sentenced to the gallows on that 23rd 23rd of January was John Lee, accused of the brutal murder of the lady for whom he worked about 2 months before. When the lady's body was found with a cut on her neck, injuries to her head, and signs of an attempt to burn the corpse, the police began to investigate the employees who lived with her. Since John was the only man, had a cut on his arm, and had a past of crimes, the police immediately named him as the main suspect, and so he was sentenced. Right after discovering his death by hanging, he announced that God would prove he was innocent somehow. Mysteriously, after 3 attempts to execute John, all of them failed without any explanation. Could it be divine justice? One way or another, to this day, it is not possible to say with certainty whether John was or was not his employer's murderer. The story of the man who escaped hanging 3 times was also told in a silent film from 1912. It gave the name to a folk music album by the British band Fairport Convention, and it led to the creation of a documentary book called The Man They Could Not Hang. Doyle Lee Hamm was supposed to be executed via lethal injection at the Holman Correctional Facility in Alabama on the 22nd of February of 2018. Before his execution, it had been determined that, due to drug use and cancer treatment, the injection would not be administered in his arms. The alternative, then, was his legs. When the time came, the team examined both of Hamm's legs, looking for a suitable vein, but found none. This, however, did not stop the executioners. Hamm was then stuck multiple times, but the injection seemed to have no effect. Finally, as the clock neared midnight, the execution was canceled because the convict's death sentence was about to expire, and he was returned to prison. There were about 2.5 hours spent trying to execute Hamm, but for some unknown reason, he seemed not to feel any effect. His sentence was then nullified, the detainee returned to prison, and he ended up passing away in 2021 from cancer. Sentenced to death for murder, the North American Alan Eugene Miller surprised his executioners by surviving at least 18 attempts at lethal injection. Alan was sentenced to death row after shooting and killing 3 people at his workplace in the city of Birmingham in 1999. The failed execution attempts took place on the 22nd of September of 2022. On that occasion, the medical team could not find a vein to inject the lethal substance into the detainee. According to Alan's lawyers, he was writhing in pain and anguish during the process. After the attorneys filed a federal lawsuit, the state of Alabama decided that Alan would not be subjected to another lethal injection attempt. Instead, the inmate will be executed via nitrogen hypoxia, a method considered more humane, but that has not yet been used in the state. In this method, the inmate is forced to breathe pure nitrogen gas through a mask, which fatally reduces the oxygen levels in the blood, and so he loses his life slowly without any pain. Maggie Dickson was a young Scottish woman who, in the 18th century, got involved with one of her employer's sons and ended up getting pregnant. In order not to lose her job, the young woman hid her pregnancy and gave birth on her own. According to Maggie, the baby was unfortunately born dead, but to her bad luck, she was caught after trying to dispose of the body and was sentenced to death. The Scot was hanged, and following the custom of the time, she remained hanging by her neck for 30 minutes. After the execution, her corpse was even placed in a coffin and taken to the cemetery. However, on the way there, Maggie miraculously came to and began to struggle inside the coffin in an inexplicable and even frightening way. She had managed to survive. At the time, since there was not much knowledge in certain areas of medicine and such, the conclusion was that the woman had received divine forgiveness. Any charges against her were dropped. Imprisoned since January of 2023 after being caught at the airport in Bali with almost 3 kilograms of cocaine, the Brazilian Manuela Vitória de Araújo Farias, originally from Santa Catarina in Brazil, was tried in June of that same year in the Asian country and received a sentence of 11 years in prison, plus the payment of 1 billion Indonesian rupiahs, the equivalent of about $58,000. According to her defense team, this outcome was a miracle because, for such cases, severe penalties such as life imprisonment and even death are usually applied. Therefore, Manuela can consider herself a woman who escaped a death sentence that was almost certain. Even her lawyers believed so. Also, according to the attorney, Manuela was used as a mule to take the drug into the country, in addition to being deceived by a criminal organization from Santa Catarina in Brazil, which promised her vacation and surf lessons. With the conviction, she will remain in a closed regime in that country, her lawyer explained. He works with her family in Brazil. The defender says there is no possibility that she will serve her time in Brazil, and that one day the sentence might allow a regime change. This means that those 11 years could be served in 6 or 7, which, according to him, is already very good. In 1650, the domestic servant Anne Green was accused and sentenced to death by hanging for committing infanticide. On the day of the sentencing after she was hanged, Green received several blows to ensure she was lifeless. Then, her body was released and taken so that medical students could use it. The students were desperate when they realized that Green's supposedly dead body was still breathing, even though slowly. So, they woke her up, and she gradually began to recover. The event was considered a miracle from God, and Anne's sin was forgiven. She ended up recovering little by little, without any sequelae despite having been without oxygen to her brain for a few minutes and having taken blows to the head. It is truly unbelievable, but according to documents and accounts, it really happened. Feoktistov grew up in Voronezh in Russia, which was under Nazi occupation during the Second World War. At 16 years old, he was gathering information for the Red Army, which was formed by the Russians in 1918 and remained until 1948. Unfortunately, he was captured by the SS, a police organization linked to Nazism, which chose to execute him with a shot to the head. The bullet in question went through Feoktistov's chin and neck, but did not kill him. The Nazis thought he was dead, and Feoktistov did nothing to dissuade them of that, for he pretended to be dead for a while. Later on, he crawled out of the trench where he had been left and managed to survive in an unbelievable way. After getting out of the trench and away from Nazi control, he was able to drag himself and walk until he reached a safe area occupied by the Soviets, who could hardly believe it when they saw him arriving in such a weakened state, practically crawling with a severe injury on his head. He ended up receiving medical care there and eventually got better. Subscribe to the channel for more videos like this.